we've looked at every method possible to be able to solve quadratic equations. Today, February 5th, 2021, we're going to look at how do we choose the best method. Really, several of these methods will work to solve a quadratic, but oftentimes there's one that's better than the other. And sometimes certain methods won't work. As I've already stated at the beginning of this class, the quadratic formula will work if there is a solution. But sometimes it's easier to do certain things. Personally, I prefer to factor. Well, let's talk about the method. First of all, we learn factoring. Now, we could factor a trinomial and discover what the solution of the quadratic was. And this is the best method, and this almost seems kind of logical when the equation itself is factorable. Sometimes they're not factorable. So the best method is factoring when we actually can factor. Then we looked at finding or using square roots. And we stated in that lesson that that's the best method, and we can really only use it when there is no B term. Remember, the B term is the one that has the X. Not the X squared, but just the X. Then we talked about completing the square. And that's the best when A is equal to 1 and B is even. It's an even number. And then lastly, we talked about the quadratic formula. And that works for all other cases. In fact, will always work. But it's a little tedious. How do I know when a quadratic is factorable? Well, the equation is factorable if the discriminant and we already know that the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. We've heard that a lot. When the discriminant itself is a perfect square. So if that discriminant is a perfect square, it can be factored. want to look at some examples of which method is best and how to choose it. X squared plus 9x plus 14 equals 0. Well, the discriminant here is 81 minus 4 times 14. Which is 25. That's a perfect square. Just looking at x squared plus 9x, I almost can see that it is factorable. Because I look at 14, I say 2 times 7 is 14, and 7 plus 2 is 9. It really looks factorable to me. So factoring would be the best choice. Now, could I do it with a quadratic formula? Yes, I could. But I'm going to do it by factoring. And so I know to factor that, it's going to be 2 sets of parentheses. X squared is x times x. I'm looking for factors of 7. And so that would be 2 times 7, 1 times 14. That's it. 2 times 7 adds to be 9. So it's plus 2 plus 7. So I've factored it. Set each factor equal to 0. And solve. So my solutions are -2 and -7. If I write that in set notation, and just write it like that. We're actually going to look at 4 examples. Let's look at a second example. This one is 9x squared minus 4. What do you see missing in that quadratic? It's the b term. There's no x. Now remember how I said when there's no b term, we can find the square root. Probably the easiest. Well, I know my first step would be to add 4 to both sides. So it'd be equals 4, and then divide by 9. So x squared equals 4 divided by 9. As I learned before, I know now I want to take the square root of both sides. Okay, so when I do that, x will be equal to, and remember when I take the square root of both sides, I also know that a positive and a negative result. And the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. So my solution here is x is equal to plus or minus 2/3. I could write that as a solution set as negative 2/3 and positive 2/3. So that's definitely probably the fastest, easiest method to use is by finding the square root. And it's real recognizable because there's no b term there. Two more methods I want to look at. And the next one, we're going to use the method of completing the square. It's best because A is 1, and you'll see that the B term is even. This is x squared minus 6x plus 7 equals 73. Now, remember, if we're going to complete the square, we're going to actually take the third term here and put some space in there. We want to really get rid of the constant, the C term. I hope you're writing this down. And so to do that, I'm going to move 7 over. In other words, I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides. And I'm going to leave a little space here. So it's going to be x squared minus 6x equals, and then 73 minus 7 is 66. Now, to complete the square, remember I take the b term, that's negative 3, divided by, that's negative 6. B term is negative 6. I divide it by 2, and that's negative 3. And then I square it. So negative 3 squared is negative 3 times negative 3. So when I complete the square, it'll be equal to 9. Right, so I'm adding 9 then to both sides. Remember, all I did was take the b term, divide it by 2, square it. And when I complete the square, when I complete it, it'll always be positive, because the only way I can square any number is to get a positive result. And once I've completed the square, that becomes something that's easily factorable. It's x minus 3, the square root of x squared, the square root of 9, and I want to bring down a negative sign because the b term was negative. And 66 plus 9, 75. And when I factor that, remember it's x minus 3 squared equals 75. So this step, I take the square root of both sides. And when I do so, I've got a positive and negative result. So my solution is x minus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 75. Really need to simplify the square root of 75. We should remember how to do that. That's 25 times 3. The square root of 25 is 5 radical 3. So I'm going to rewrite that as x minus 3 equals plus or minus 5 radical 3. That's simplified. Add 3 to both sides. X is equal to 3 plus or minus 5 radical 3. And that's my solution. Now, I could go and get decimal answers, or I could leave it just like that as a radical solution. I could write 3 plus 5 radical 3, or I could write 3 minus 5 radical 3. Last problem is one that's going to be best to solve using the quadratic formula. It's 2x squared plus 8x plus 10 equals 3. Now we know in order for the quadratic formula to work, we've got to set equal to 0, so I've got to subtract 3 from both sides. So I need to rewrite it as 2x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. Because remember, I subtracted 3. Minus 3 here, minus 3 here. Just looking at that quadratic with there being an A term and 8 and 7, it looks really difficult to factor. Quadratic formula is definitely going to be my best choice. So I'll use the b squared minus 4ac. We've gotten pretty good at that. That's going to be 8 times 8, which is 64, minus 4 times 2 times 7. So I got to calculate what that is. I'll be subtracting something from 64. It'll be 64 minus 4 times 2 times 7, and I'll be left with 8. So my solution is then the opposite of b. b was 8, so it's negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 all over 2 times 2, which is 4. We already know that I can get decimal answers using the quadratic formula. I'm going to simplify this radical because you might see a multiple choice answer that was a radical. So 8 is 4 times 2, so this is 2 radical 2 over 4. A radical answer can be broken down into 2 ways. We could say a negative 8 divided by 4 is a negative 2 plus or minus 2 radical 2 over 4. And we can't leave it that way. That fraction has to be reduced. That's 2/4. So it would be x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 1/2 or radical 2 over 2. That way it could be written that way. Also, if you were given a multiple choice answer in a test, we could have just left it and reduced it only by 2 and said negative 4 plus or minus radical 2 over 2. Those are the 2 different ways that it could have been written. And as we've already seen today in today's lesson and through IXL, we also can get some decimal answers to, and we typically will say to 2 decimal places. So it's going to be negative 8 plus radical 7, make that radical 8, excuse me, divided by 4. So it's negative 1.292, so we'll say negative 1.29, or a negative 8 plus, make that minus radical 8, divided by 4. And that answer is negative 2.71. So the solution set there could be a negative 2.71 and negative 1.29. Those are just approximations because there's more decimal places. If you were given multiple choices, and this is something you might want to listen to. If you give them multiple choices that are radical answers, and your radical answer, probably on a test, it would be this one. But you found a decimal answer, and just do the math with that and find the decimal to this one and match it up. So that's how we choose the best method with all the methods that we've been given.